I guess my question is, when you were talking about your philosophical and spiritual journey, you talked about like personal dispositions and kind of the shape of your mind and searching for some sort of fit between that and the thinkers that you were reading. And I was wondering how you thought about this ideal of like correspondence and fit and your own personal dispositions with truth with a capital T. How do you see that relationship?
Oh my, you know, to answer the question in a philosophically perspicuous way, I would have to be able to step outside of myself and my own dispositions, which are to a degree opaque to me, as I think they are to us all. I've tried to think some things out, and until I have, I'm not happy with my views. But I know that my views, the soil in which my views grow, lies beyond or beneath my own powers of rational inspection or reconstruction. I think I can make some progress understanding myself and why I feel drawn to one thing or appalled by another or disinterested in it, but it's limited. And I know that I have certain elementary moods that incline me in one direction or another. In the same way, some people are optimists and others are pessimists. And I don't think optimism or pessimism is something you can either be argued into or argued out of. Ultimately, it kind of sets the stage for the life of reflection. It's a gravitational field within which thinking proceeds, and I'm no different than anybody else. And so when I say I was temperamentally drawn to Aristotle, temperamentally drawn to Aristotle, it's because so many of the things, reading Plato is thrilling, but so many of the things that he philosophically gave the back of his hand to, I loved. I loved the theater of sights and sounds, the spectacle. I loved that. And I wanted, if I was going to find God, he had to be right in the theater and not elsewhere. But why? Why? Don't know. Reason goes only so far. Mr. Parker.
Thank you, this is wonderful. Assuming there are no children's books versions of Spinoza or Lessons of a Born-Again Pagan, how did you and your wife think about passing these views of the world and these truths down to your children?
Well, Nancy, my wife, is a completely, well, let me put it this way, she has no religious curiosity. She and I are apples and oranges when it comes to that. She's also not an observant Jew, never has been. She never had a bat mitzvah. She quit Sunday school because she told her parents that it made her legs hurt, and they believed her, and that got her out of it. But she has a fierce Jewish identity. And for her, that is importantly, not exclusively, but importantly, a question of family loyalty and family identity. So when we married and had children, it really went without saying, we never discussed it, that our children would receive a rudimentary Jewish education and be bar bat mitzvahed and be brought up to know that they are Jews. And we enforce that in, lots of small ways. And they all think of themselves, decidedly as Jewish. And they are intermittently Jewish in their practices. They go to temple, some of them, on some holidays, but that's pretty much it. But the identity is very strong. And Nancy and I felt it wasn't even a question, wasn't something we set out to do deliberately, it just went without saying, that we would make sure that it was passed along. And I would say that let me start a little differently. I spend a lot of time with all of my kids. Our dinner table is like this at home. It was from the time they were little. We set the table and lit the candles every night for dinner from the time they were infants. And there was always a conversation, single conversation around the table. And when they were able to participate, they did. And that was it. And they kind of grew up experiencing that as life. That's what life is. What family life, but the life of the spirit, of the mind and the spirit is. And so I think to the extent for me that is welded to my notion of Jewishness, it is for them too. I don't know if that's a complete answer, but it's at least a part of an answer.
Thank you, Professor. So my question is kind of twofold. You mentioned sort of like going deeper and deeper into Aristotle, especially after you found out that he was sort of like Christianized, but he didn't want to give up that sort of like Aristotelianism. I guess I'm wondering, what was your reaction? I'm assuming you probably encountered this in Aristotle. What was your reaction when you read about his account of the unmoved mover or the prime mover?
When I read?
The unmoved mover, the prime mover, right?
Yeah.
Which, many a Christian would say,
Sure.
That's God he
Yeah,
was
sure.
talking about. And then
Sure.
the second part of that question is, you spoke about Spinoza. Spinoza has this whole philosophy of natura naturans, right? God,
Yeah.
sort of like in nature. But then if you turn to people who were sort of contemporaries of Spinoza, or I don't know, it was before him, Thomas Hobbes has this whole account of the state of nature. In the state of nature, we are essentially beasts, right? We are brutes who are in a war of all against all. But then you mentioned, you believe in the indignity or the worth of the individual. So how do you sort of like reconcile this account that if God is natural, if God is personified nature, or if God is natural, then what accounts for the brutality we inflict on each other?
Sure. Well, those are three questions, really. The prime mover, natura naturata, natura naturans, and then man the beast. Yes, the passages in the physics and elsewhere where Aristotle describes or discusses the prime mover, it's tempting to read those in a, you might say, a proto-creationist way. He's talking about a God outside of the natural realm who sets it in motion, maybe not through a creative act, but just by being such an outstanding example of fulfilled being that everything in nature strives to imitate or exemplify it in whatever way it can. But I think we are blinded by our Christian habits, Abrahamic habits really, when it comes to reading that passage. And the better way, which is to say the way that's more consistent with the fundamental premises of Aristotle's metaphysics, is that what he means by the prime mover is the eternality of the internal actuating principle that runs the world, the axis of fulfilled being around which all the motions in the world revolve, but isn't something outside of the world, external to it, but the indwelling principle of realization that is the world's own indwelling engine or something like that. Natura naturata, natura naturans, these for Spinoza are different ways of describing one thing, which is the world. The world can be viewed under two different aspects, you might say. These are two descriptive perspectives from which we can view the world, but the world is one, and we shouldn't think that actually there are two things, a world and then something else which is moving it, that sets it in motion, and that these two terms are meant to imply a division between them. That would be completely incompatible with Spinoza's fundamental monism, which rules out any division of that kind. And as to bestiality, Spinoza, like Hobbes, recognized that most people, to begin with, most of the time, are pretty bestial, and that it takes a lot of work on the part of their teachers and others to work them up into some respectable human shape. I think that's true. I'm not a Rousseauian. I keep pointing to Harrison over here because he's not only a student of Plato, but of Rousseau too, about whom I have very mixed feelings. I think people, there are prospects of good that can be developed and elaborated, but the raw material isn't, it isn't altogether happy. And Spinoza believed that. He said, in a state of nature, human beings behave in the way everything else in a state of nature does. And what is the fundamental law of the state of nature? The state that exists before human beings form civilized societies in which to live and interact. The fundamental law of the state of nature is the big fish eat the little fish. That's Spinoza's phrase. Big fish eat the little fish. And that certainly was Hobbes's view too. So I think there's actually, you don't have to be an optimist about human beings in the Rousseauian sense to be a Spinozist, in my sense, I think. But we're getting pretty deep into the weeds here. Jonathan.
Can we pass the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, pass the mic. It's a bit of a...
I shouldn't be calling you. This is your
No, you
job.
you can come on.
Thanks, Professor, for coming and sharing your thoughts. I think you misspoke once, though. You said you and your wife aren't very observant Jews, but I can't think of an act more Jewish than using kvetching to get out of going to synagogue or Sunday school.
Yeah, it's true. My leg hurts. Well, and to which her father said, well, show me, how was it before it didn't work? She said, oh, and then she just walked across the room. Lost that battle, but learned.
But joke aside, there seems to be a bit of a tension in your intellectual journey in that, if I heard you correctly, part of your discontent with kind of Aristotelian or Platonic thought is the not complete, but some measure of lack of role for an individual and individualism and kind of the divine individual or something to that effect. But at the very end, you ended on a note of almost Oakeshottian humility when it came towards perpetuating the Jewish faith and how you passed on to others, and that seems to be almost communitarian in a way that like truly political inner of the polis would have seen an individual as part of a greater body. Yeah. Is that is there a tension there? I think there are ways to explain how that's different, but it seems kind of interesting that you've kind of ended up with the thing that you were initially dissatisfied with.
I think there is. I've thought about that. My wife has reminded me of it. She does so regularly, and I don't know that I have a way of reconciling these in any fashion that wouldn't just be kind of glib and not very satisfying. But I'm a pretty when it comes to spiritual matters, a pretty solitary person. I like to think things out for myself. In that sense, I follow Spinoza's way, which was the way of the solitary walker, thinker. You know, he kept to himself. He had friends, but he pretty much kept to himself when it came to matters of the mind and maybe of the heart too. He had a need, at least a modest need, for the presence of other people in his life. He didn't live in a cave. He socialized. I certainly have that. I feel that very strongly. But I feel an allegiance and a loyalty to the traditions of Jewish life that I think Spinoza would have found puzzling because incompatible with the self-sufficiency of the fully rational individual. And I'm not prepared to say it's just a confession of my own inadequacies as a thinker, that I have to fall back on something as weak as a tradition and a community and so on and so forth. It's really of the essence for me. So there it is. You are acute to note the tension, and all I can say is it's me, and I suspect it's not an unfamiliar predicament, if that's the right word. I don't think that it is, but situation in which to find oneself, and that many of you probably feel some version of it too.
It's already down there. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor. I'm Josh, and I had a question along some similar lines.
Turn on your microphone so I can hear. It'd be easier for me to hear. Is it on?
It's just for the recording, so
Oh,
you'll
it
have
is.
to project
Okay.
a little.
Yeah, sure. Just another question about the role of the individual, and you mentioned that you don't think a fair reading of Aristotle or Plato could point to kind of a focus on the individual, and that was something that you found wanting, and then you found it in Spinoza, and you also mentioned that you, from a very young age, found the eternal or the divine in the world and in nature, and I was curious how you would ground your belief in the dignity of every individual human being. One, that I obviously share that belief, but I'm curious whether that is something that you think just comes from instinct or intuition, like you mentioned some of your beliefs do, or is that something that comes from other priors that you have? And relatedly, does your belief that the eternal or the divine sits, or could be fairly said to sit within the world itself, does that, given your like love of nature that you talked about, is that you saying that you find the eternal or the divine in nature itself on its own? Is humanity part of that, or is humanity set apart from it? And if it's part of nature, then maybe that's where your belief in the dignity of every human being comes from, because we have a spark of the divine in ourselves.
Yeah. Well, let me start at the back end. That's perhaps the easier part of the question to answer. Spinoza famously said, the human being is not a kingdom apart, and a separate enclave within the world. We are part of the world. We are as natural as everything else in the world, and not privileged in any special way. That's an attractive view in some ways and a challenging view in others, because we like to think of ourselves as possessing powers and having responsibilities which do set us apart from other living things and indeed from everything else in the world. All of human ethical life and political life is based on the assumption that we are, in some sense or other, a kingdom apart. Spinoza starts with a metaphysical argument for the reality of the individuality of every single thing. An argument, to put it a little differently, an argument for the proposition that what makes one thing different from another is something real and not illusory, as both Plato and Aristotle believed. And if the dignity of a thing, of anything before we get to human beings, is a function of its reality, if it's entitled to our attention and respect because it's real, and if the individuality of each individual is something real, then it deserves our attention and respect. I mean, one poetic way of expressing this thought is Walt Whitman's. He says, you know, there is nothing in the world, nothing, however insignificant it seems, that isn't worth a lifetime of observation and pondering. No matter how trivial it seems to be, there is more to it than you could fathom in not just a lifetime, but any number of lifetimes. And that makes it literally respectable, something that is worthy of being respected. And that's true of human beings too. Of course, we respect human beings in a general and rather abstract way when we say every human being, we believe every human being to be endowed with certain basic powers, and we honor their right to employ or express those powers as they wish. That's a very thin kind of respect, though. It's respecting everybody around this table because he or she is endowed with the elementary power to chart a course in life of their own choosing, and that kind of thing. When we talk about, you know, civil rights and the right to vote and the right to be treated as a person, entitled to equal respect, these are the things that we generally have in mind. But there's another sense of respect, which is, I think, more interesting and deeper and more satisfying and closer to Spinoza's and Whitman's, which is that each one of us is, this is Whitman's formulation in a Spinozistic spirit, each one of us is an absolutely singular perspective on the divinity of the world. Each one of us, if you think of the world, this is very crude, as a diamond with an infinite number of facets. Each of us is a facet, and without that facet, which is singular, the diamond would be incomplete and imperfect. And so the work that we have to do, each one of us, is to perfect the singularity of that perspective, which we are. And this is loosely connected to notions of authenticity and self-expression and self-development. But that's where it's in the his metaphysical argument for the reality of the individuality of individuals that Spinoza gets the purchase that he needs in order to work his way around to this. I've been very abstract about that, and I apologize, but Aristotle's view is that to become a perfect human being, as perfect as a human being can be, means to work to conform your life to a certain type. There is a type. And the closer you come, the more perfect you are, and you can achieve it fully. And it's no different from one person than another. So this fully realized human being is fully realized in just the same way and for the same reasons as that one. They're indistinguishable. This refined gentleman is no different from that refined gentleman. And what's peculiar about them, their sense of humor, their moods, their particular passions, those don't figure at all in their human being, and therefore in what we mean by the perfection of their human being. This is, to put it crudely, a stereotypical conception of perfection, whereas Spinoza's and Whitman's and many other thinkers is idiosyncratic. And that's not just I've been putting this in, I apologize for it, in very abstract metaphysical terms. It's also it's an ethical difference. It's an aesthetic difference. All of modern art rests on the assumption that the individuality of individuals is the thing we're striving to grasp or portray.
Thank you, Professor Kronman, for speaking with us. My name is Gabriel, and I have a less philosophical question, picking up on two things you said. The first is how difficult the past 5 days have been for you, and it resonates with me deeply.
Yeah.
And the second is how much you love the world, and this love for what is here in the moment. And I also find myself with a great deal of love for the world, and I'm wondering how you reconcile this in a time that is so difficult. How do you find love for the world, and how do you, when things are painful, I think it's very easy to resort to hate, resort to very bad feelings. How do you find love in that? Or is it that we should, have a time for peace, a time for war, a time for hate, and a time for love? What would you say to that?
Right. Well, it's a very difficult question. I suspect the answer, I don't know that there's a single answer to that question. It probably varies from person to person. For me, it helps. In fact, I would say it's essential to have friends. And talking with my friends and sharing my feelings and my anguish and listening to them is not a cure for the unhappiness, but it's good medicine. It's some significant solace. And you can love the world, Gabriel, as you and I do, and recognize that it's not a cakewalk, that it's filled with all sorts of, the world is a theater of disappointments. But if you lost your love of the world because of that, even when the disappointments are grave, I would say the love was not very solid to begin with. So it has to be durable, and it's and I don't know. I think it's just, in addition to friendship, it's important to the extent you can, to try to take a long view of things and remember that neither the good nor the bad lasts forever and doesn't really last for very long, and that better days will come, but that they won't come on their own. They will come with struggle and with bloodshed. And that is the awful fact that I think we are all facing right now, that better days will come for Israel. I feel sure of that, but I don't yet quite see how or when or at what cost. So, my confidence is tempered by opacity. When I look at when I open my CNN feed, I don't have a clue what's going to happen next, but it will be better. Yeah, that sounds pretty Pollyannish. I wish I could say something more confident and reassuring, but I can't. It would be false.
Professor Andrew, please.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Andrew. I found your words very moving. At the start of your talk, you talked about religious curiosity sort of as this fascination with something beyond ourselves, a fascination with the eternity beyond the here and now. And a lot of the rest of your talk was really describing your journey pursuing this fascination. I'm wondering, how satisfied are you with the answers you found? And how satisfied do you think anyone can be with the answers they find through philosophy, religion, or whatever else?
Not completely and not altogether. If I said I've reached the end, I know now all that I could wish to know. I understand these matters to my complete and final satisfaction. That itself would be completely incompatible with the Spinozist proposition that we're always on the way. So, I feel like I'm making progress, that I've clarified some things. I see more clearly what it was about Aristotle, for example, that attracted me, and what the deficiencies are and how they might be repaired. But tons of questions remain, and every little further beachhead of intellectual confidence that I establish for myself just opens a whole new continent of problems. They grow in the dark, the problems, They multiply overnight. I don't know how it can be, but every little bit of confidence becomes 1,000 new insecurities. But that is I'm happy with that, because I feel like I'm thinking and moving and loving in the right direction. And it feels fulfilling even if I'm not fulfilled. And I don't know what would the alternative to that be. I would just make just one. Your opening comment made me think that it's important to probably emphasize one thing. There are many, many, many people who are selflessly devoted to other people, to their countries, to worldly institutions, much larger than themselves. They think of themselves as little subordinate or even insignificant nothings by comparison with the cause they serve. Someone might feel that way about Yale, for example. I know people who do. They give their life for Yale and serve it selflessly. But they don't think a lot about eternity and the relationship of time to the everlasting. They are worldly men and women. I'm reminded of Machiavelli's remark. Who mentioned Machiavelli? Ben mentioned Machiavelli in his History of Florence. Is it Machiavelli or Guicciardini, who was a contemporary of Machiavelli's and a great historian of Florence? I'm sure it was Machiavelli. He said, God help me, but I love my city more than my own soul. That is the worldly spirit right there. I don't know, don't talk to me about eternity. My city needs me. And of course, from the vantage point of the religiously curious person, that looks like an absurd little preoccupation. Really? You're moving deck chairs around on the Titanic. Not even that. This is the most absurd thing in the world. How could can't you hear the thunder of God? How can you possibly be interested or preoccupied with something as trivial as that? And of course, from the perspective of the worldly person, the passions and obsessions of the otherworldly person look equally ridiculous and dangerous. And there's nothing that's more corrosive of political life and its demands than the spirit of religion. Because the minute you invoke eternity, everything that human beings are struggling to do in some practice, it just looks so ridiculously small, it gets swept off the table. So these two, the worldly and the otherworldly, have to be kept apart for the sake of both. And that's one reason, I think it's ultimately the main reason, why we separate church and state. It's the meaning of the religion clauses in the Constitution of the United States.
Well, on that note, it's 9:30 and we've reached our soft close, but there is dessert, fruit, and maybe babka, I'm not sure, but at least fruit. And wine, and if Professor Kronman is willing to stay,
I'll stay for a bit. Soft close is a phrase I haven't heard before, but I think I understand what it means, and I'm now going to live a soft close,
great.
so I can stay around for a bit.
We'll stay here to chat if you want to come up and
Okay.
speak with Kronman, please do. But
Good.
thank you all very much, and most of all, thank you, Professor Kronman.
Yeah,
for-
thank you all.